the Coachman. There were 4 of us. Me, Roberts, Harry, and of course, Clayton. 4 American boys done with school, in those days, kings of the world. Off to Europe we went with more money than was good for us, serious debauchery. We boozed and fornicated our way up the Italian boot. Clayton almost got arrested in the Vatican. A one-eyed priest called him a damned boy, and it was only later I realized he had meant it in a spiritual sense and not, as we laughingly thought, as a clumsy attempt to curse in American. We reached the top of the boot before vacation was over. We had 3 weeks left and no idea where to go. At a train station, we got a tip to go across the mountains, so we just kept going across the border and into Austria. We stepped off the train in a place called Clargenfort, a city situated next to a lake we were assured was just a thing for tourists. Outside the city limits, it was an old place, peasant country, a place where people are afraid of ghosts, not telling stories about them, not believing in them in some abstract fashion. That's a pleasant shudder around a fire. The country people in those days knew real fear, and that's a very different thing. The city itself is over 700 years old, and most of the old houses in the center are still standing. Not that the 4 of us cared about those things. We were tired. Italy had worn us out. So we bought some cases of booze and rented a small shack outside the city, out on the swampy meadows around the lake. The place was like a moor, really, with very soggy ground. But you woke up to see the lake out the front door, and there weren't any neighbors to bother you. At night, you could see the city at a distance, and if you turned and looked in the other direction, you saw the moor, and those lights, odd lights, green and blue, dancing in the dark. I began to feel queer about the place then, that first night. I don't know about the others, but I looked at those lights, and there was something timeless about them. You can call them swamp gas all you want, but I didn't like them at all. For 3 days, we didn't leave our shack on the moor. We spent the days drinking, swimming, and sleeping. The days were beautiful, warm, dry summer heat, and the water cold and deep, and so clear you could see fish all the way down at the bottom, fish so huge they must have come with the beginning of the lake. By the end of the 4th day, all of us were a little tired of doing nothing. Robert started looking through the cabin. A lot of junk accumulates in a place that's been rented out over the years. He found this odd little book, sort of a history of the place. It was a shabby old thing, printed I think sometime in the 30s. The cover was missing, the pages stiff as cardboard, and it had a horrible smell to it. The odd thing was, it was in English. I don't remember any of the stories in that book, folk legends collected in the area. I only glanced at it. Stories about dragons on the moor and angry dwarves drowning cities for their sins. But one story I do remember. Roberts read it to us that night, the 4th night at the cabin. It was the story of the Coachman. There was a very rich man living in that city. That was around 1430-something. I remember thinking that it was some time before Columbus. The book still spelled the name of the city in an old way, and just looking at that spelling, you saw ancient mists over the lake. Anyway, this very rich man built a moderate estate on the moors, directly by the lake. His purpose was to establish a small group of fishermen and their families to supply the city on market days and make a profit doing it. In this man's employ, from many years earlier, was a coachman. He was the most trusted servant of the household, a man who worked magic with horses. His master was absurdly fond of the animals, and this had been an early connection between the two that now led to the coachman's advancement. He was given a house on the moor and was charged with overseeing the fishermen. He became his master's eyes and ears, and a solid, honest man he seemed to be. He never drank, he never gambled. He saw to the transport of the fish and reported on the conduct and morals of the outpost. He was then, at the beginning of the story, no longer just a simple servant. In fact, the coachman became something of a ruler over the 6 households by the lake. After a year, his master became ill, and the coachman's power grew. Little direction came his way from the city, and as long as the fish arrived in time for Thursday's market, he was left alone and was never questioned. He began to turn strange. He left his house for a small cabin that he built further out into the moor. He dug a pit next to the cabin that filled with warm mud, oozing out of the ground like the blood of the earth. The coachman was seen to bathe in it. At night he would sit in that hole, talking as he wallowed in the mud. He held real conversations with pauses allowed for responses nobody else could hear. The families living on the estate were concerned, but they did not suspect any outright danger, not until the first girl vanished. She was 15, the most beautiful girl living on the moor, to be married the next spring. She had left her friends one evening, and from the way she smiled, they were sure she had arranged to meet the boy she was to marry. She was presumed drowned, not an uncommon occurrence in fishing communities, but 2 months later, a second girl disappeared without a trace, and a mere 2 days after that, a third. Panic ensued. The families left without packing after that third girl. They rushed to the city, food still sitting on the tables in their houses. When the authorities came for the coachman, for his strange behavior of the previous months had been reported, they expected to find that he'd gone. But he sat in front of his cabin, calmly smoking a pipe. He didn't speak, ask any questions, or defend himself in any way. He went peacefully. This is what he confessed under torture. He had seduced the girls. He had them bathe in a hole of mud by his cabin at night. Then he split their heads with an axe and chopped their bodies into pieces. Pieces small as little mice, he said. He left them there in the mud to bathe in and to bathe his new victims as their turns came. There were 2 things about the coachman's confession that horrified the city. The first was that the confession extracted under torture was not given with screams and sobs of pain. He had been oblivious to the cruelest methods of interrogation. He had flung his confession at them, laughing and telling them to go and look into that mud hole and to look deep. That led to the discovery of the second peculiarity. In that hole, there were found far more pieces of dismembered bodies than could be accounted for with the missing girls. It is said that there were enough bones to make at least 20 humans, men, women, and children, intermingled with the small bones of animals, some of them unidentifiable and utterly grotesque. The coachman was drawn and quartered in the town square. His house was burned to the ground. That's the story as Roberts read it that night. Our reaction to it was predictable. From some references to the lake shore in the account, we concluded that the coachman's crimes had occurred in the very area where we had taken our cabin. It seemed unchanged from centuries ago, still a moor, lights still dancing at night. We were drunk and stupid, and it was late, and it was dark outside. Of course, we went to look for the place. We took our flashlights and followed Roberts, who carried the book. There was a good deal of laughing and joking as we set out, not so much later. We stumbled around on that moor, finding absolutely nothing, laughing if one of us stepped into a bog and sank up to his knees, stopping now and then to relieve ourselves. After 2 hours or so, the joke had gone stale. I remember clearly that it was Clayton who gave our search a new direction. He had the idea just as we were about to head for home. He sat in the grass and he turned off his flashlight. We stopped turning ours off too, and Clayton pointed to where the moor lights were dancing. "What if that's the coachman over there?" he said. We set off in the dark after those lights. After 15 minutes, we ran into the stones. We all stopped, looking at them. There was no mistaking it. Overgrown as they were, they could form nothing but the foundation of a house. At once we turned on our lights. We looked at the stones, and nobody said anything, and all the frogs in the bog croaked on and on as always. Roberts called out, "Look at this, over here." We followed his light with ours. There was a depression in the ground. It looked like a bowl 6 feet across, covered with grass and dead leaves. The depression was slight now, but it had clearly been much deeper once. It was just a scar now, unnatural looking. It was right next to where the house once stood. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or not. It was funny, us stumbling across the moor on this drunken lark, looking for this storybook house of horrors. To find a site so fitting in all particulars, my God, it was probably some hunter's cabin, but I thought it was a great joke in any case. Well, Clayton had no difficulty deciding on a reaction. He laughed like this was the best joke he'd ever heard. That broke the spell for the rest of us. At once we reverted to ignorant, loud, drunken boys. That's when we did it, the unforgivable. It was a joke, nothing more. We had pulled dozens like it all through that summer. Harry started it by making an eerie sound, a really bad ghost sound it was. And I laughed and I said, "You've done it, Clayton. You found the coachman's house. What now? You want to take a bath?" I should have died before I said it. Harry kept up that stupid sound, holding his flashlight under his chin like a child, and we all started crowding Clayton, and Robert said, in his best Lugosi, "Blood. The coachman wants blood." We were all in on it, making all kinds of crazy noises and howling. We grabbed Clayton, who was laughing, and we pushed him, yelling all the time, "Blood! The coachman wants to take a bath! The coachman wants to take a bath!" That was the last time I ever saw Clayton laugh. "We got another pretty for you, coachman. Come and get it. Bath's ready." And we pushed Clayton into the hole, into that depression holding him down. "Another pretty, Mr. Coachman." And Robert started yelling, noch eine schöne, come on, coachman. She's a beauty." Clayton started fighting us, which added to the fun. He was kicking, bucking, like he was almost crazy. Then we heard clearly a voice from the dark saying very calmly, "Fine." We stopped. We looked around and Harry said, "What the hell?" We listened, but there was nothing. And then Robert said, "Fine." And at that we were laughing again and started to get up. Clayton shook us off, and I noticed that he seemed really angry. He cussed at us, and we turned sheepish at once, as drunks will. "Oh, come on, Clayton. Come here, have a drink, Clayton." He staggered away from us, and he began to brush the front of his clothes with both hands. He wouldn't stand still, and I started to realize that he wasn't angry. He was terrified. He had a look on his face like a man you read about whose hair just goes white overnight. Harry and Roberts turned nasty. They thought he was taking offense at nothing, and they resented it. "Fine then, go to hell, Clayton. Yeah, who the hell needs you? Fine." "Fine." "Come on, Harry." Clayton kept pacing, but he looked unsteady, and he still kept up that brushing with both hands. I went over to him. "Clayton, come on, buddy." He looked at me, but then his eyes were all over the moor, darting back and forth. "Alice," he said. "Alice." He was nothing like the crass, overbearing character I knew, and truth be told, I had always feared to an extent. The change was sudden, and it had struck somewhere deep in his core, ferociously. "Can we go home?" he asked, sounding like a small boy afraid of the dark. "Sure, we're going. We're heading back right now," I said. He shook his head. "No, not there. Can we really go home?" All the time, he was brushing off his clothes. He was shaking when we got him back to the cabin. Harry and Roberts were quiet now. We thought he may have been bitten by something, but there was no sign of it. Eventually, Harry and Roberts fell asleep. I settled down to watch Clayton. He would drift off, lie quiet for a while. Then he would grind his teeth. Then his eyes flew open, but I could tell he was still sleeping, and they were sightless like a corpse's. It was as if his body, his eyes, responded to some alarm or danger. His eyes were looking for something, but there wasn't anything to see. They closed again and he seemed quiet. Then he moaned, tossing and turning. I just kept watching him, half dead with fatigue myself, but shaken and riled up, too tired to get up, but exploding with the need to move. I kept watching him, thanking God I couldn't see what was inside the tortured head. Around 4 a.m, his left hand started to brush the front of his clothes, gently. When the sun came up, I felt better, realizing with an odd sense of surprise that the night had been completely ordinary aside from Clayton's tortured sleep. The lake, where the light hit it, was just as beautiful as ever. Clayton too improved as the morning went on. We all went for a swim and had breakfast. And while nobody said very much, the day passed in wonderful normalcy. We played cards and talked about school. About 11 at night, we went to sleep. 40 minutes later, my eyes flew open as I heard Clayton moan. A frightened little sound, small as little. Then he sat bolt upright with a startled gasp. "Clayton," I called, and I turned on a light. He looked at me. He was drenched in sweat. He was breathing heavily through his mouth. "Are you all right?" I asked. He looked at me, trying to place me. He ran a hand through his hair and shook his head. The next morning, I took charge. I told Harry and Robert to stay by the cabin while I took Clayton into the city. We would find an apothecary, get him something to make him sleep and not dream. He looked terrible, aged and sick. The walk itself could only do him good, so would getting away from the moor. I didn't want him to get up at night and see the lights dancing in the distance. I thought something terrible would happen if he saw the lights. We set off, and I was pleased to see that he grew calmer with every step we took. He hadn't said a word the entire morning, but as our surroundings changed, he seemed to gain his composure to the point where I blamed myself for having waited a day before getting him off the moor. Clayton began to tell me about the things he had dreamed in the night. The worst of it, he said, was the dream of something black and shapeless. It was the size of a large bull, and it came towards him. It came at incredible speed, and in spite of its lack of any definite shape, he had a sense of it straining, running in some way with utmost urgency. Clayton knew it would take some time to reach him. It had very, very far to go. But it was coming, just as quickly as it could. The heart of Clargenfort is an elongated city square referred to as the Old Square. It marks the extent of the town in its infancy. Today, shops inhabit the old buildings, which are beautifully restored, the facades painted and sporting flower boxes. In the summer, there's a constant, pleasant stream of tourists. The square goes on for about a mile, and you can't see one end of it from the other because there's a slight curve to it. I'm told that there's far more room in the old structures than any business has any use for. Not refurbished, these parts stand empty, and there are many passageways and silent rooms with doors seemingly built for dwarves. At the very end of the square stands the old town castle, the courtyard open to the square. Painted a friendly white, it is featured on most postcards for sale in the city. This courtyard is where, over 500 years ago, the Coachman met his end. Clayton and I entered the square from the opposite end. It was a beautiful day, and I loved seeing the people, shops, souvenirs, ice cream. At that moment, I knew I didn't want to return to the moor. I felt an intense revulsion towards that place, and the thought of the nights I had spent there filled me with a sick, dirty feeling. But here I saw tourists, pretty girls, children, grandparents. I loved seeing all that life, and I turned to Clayton in the hope of seeing him similarly restored by the sight. His face was rigid and had lost all color. His eyes were wide open. He looked as if he had felt a tremor and was taking a moment to decide between a truck passing and an earthquake. "What?" I asked. He stopped, blinking fast several times. "Did you see it?" he asked. "See what?" He shook his head. He looked like he was about to say something, but he stopped himself and wiped his eyes. Then he jerked his head to the right. "There," he called. "Did you see it?" "What?" I asked, increasingly desperate. "What am I looking for?" He remained very still, and whatever had struck him seemed to be passing. "It's nothing now," he said. "For a moment I thought everything was gray. For a moment there wasn't any color, or hardly any, and the houses were different." I shook my head. "Maybe a cloud passed before the sun," I suggested. He nodded, and we walked on. I felt the wind in my face for a moment. That was uncomfortably cold and deeply unpleasant. It smelled of the moor. My eyes sought out the tourists, as if for comfort. The storefronts were resplendent in color, summer reds and bright greens and yellows. I glanced at Clayton, but I didn't want to ask him what he had seen. I turned back towards the Japanese couple I had noticed in passing. They were gone. There was nothing where I had seen them but a moment earlier. I noticed the house, the store from which they had emerged. Its lines seemed blurry. I blinked, but it still seemed uncertain, as if seen through a shield of searing heat. The house was slate gray and looked rough, like raw stone. I inhaled sharply, seized by an urgent sense of danger. Then I saw the tourists again. They were there, right where they should have been. The house behind them was a clothing store, painted green and white, colors playing in the windows. But for a moment, none of it had been there. They and the house had, I realized, just come back. I stopped. My breath was racing. "You too?" Clayton asked. "Just now? Like the color wasn't, and the people weren't there." Clayton nodded. We stood in the middle of the square. Clayton looked back in the direction from which we had come. "We have to keep going," he said. He sounded urgent, and I wasn't sure why. We passed the tourist couple. I kept my eyes on them, but nothing happened. Only when I turned my head forward again did I notice the building behind them. No color. The lines were blurry. I turned to face it. Now 2 houses were rough and cold and empty. "Jesus," I said. We kept moving, and now I noticed it everywhere. The friendly facade seemed to blink in and out whenever I wasn't looking. It was like the dark, hostile stones were projected over them, coming and going, the old pulsing over the new. I noticed a change in sound, too. At times it grew quiet, very few voices. Then I heard a burst of French or English, but it faded away, crowded out like the stones, and people, 2 layers, the dark one gaining. Fewer and fewer people seemed to be around, and suddenly I noticed one of the dark gray houses to my left. The lines were solid now, and whatever store had been there when we entered the square was gone. In the 2nd-story window was a dwarf. He wore a hat with a long red feather in it. He leaned out of the window, staring at me, frowning. Then he spat down from his perch and slammed the heavy wooden shutters. I looked down, and the pavement had changed, hard-packed dirt covered with straw. "Jesus," I said. And a man in a long black gown caught my eye as he drifted past us and shook his head with a solemn expression. He put me in mind, of all things, of a plague doctor. "Keep going," I heard Clayton's voice. I felt it the moment he said it. Knew it was there. "It's behind us. Keep moving and don't look," Clayton said. I wouldn't have turned around for anything. Whatever walked behind us was malevolent. Plump, fearless rats stared at us from doorways and cracked walls. I heard music, 6 notes of a fast melody repeated 3 or 4 times, then fading as quickly as it had begun. I'd never heard that instrument before. It sounded like a moan for all the gaiety of the tune. Who would dance to that? We went on, the world becoming greyer around us, until we found ourselves at the far end of the square, standing in front of the old castle. These weren't the white, pretty towers of the postcards. They stood iron grey and harsh, with only a tremor about the very top of the towers where their transformation was just finishing. "Alice," Clayton said, "it's here. It's here now." It was so cold suddenly and so quiet. I caught sight of what had come. He stood in an archway of the castle in the shadows. He wore an old shabby tunic, and he had sturdy bowed legs, like a man who lives with horses. He looked at us from the distance with palpable, cruel meanness. What had come was sick and filthy, and I couldn't stand looking at it. "Damned boy," Clayton said. "Please," I said, "please, don't speak to it." A bolt of light shot across the courtyard. The light had flashed off the axe blade. "Our Father," Clayton said, but he was stuck there with nowhere to go. "Our Father, our Father." The apparition moved. It came in a queer loping gait that carried it toward us at unnatural speed, as if it were pulled along, covering 10 yards with every step. Our Father, Clayton sobbed. I couldn't stand it. I turned and bolted. I ran, knowing this devil's thing was somewhere behind me, that thing that glided at us from the archway. I ran, and I'm not ashamed, because I knew then, and I know now, it was Clayton it wanted, and there was nothing in the world that could have saved him. I ran, seeing nothing, and a sound came from behind me, a howl and a high, triumphant squeal. I was blind then, and I sobbed as I ran down that horrible, empty square. I ran until I saw a flash of red color. Then another, and I heard voices, and I saw more color, and I slowed, my eyes drinking it in, dying for it, and finally I found myself standing in front of that clothing store. I turned around, and I saw one of the gray stone buildings fade away. It simply retreated, and I had the thought that there was some intelligence pulling the new over the old like a cover. I sank to my knees on the pavement, touching it, crying, looking up every few moments, expecting blurry lines again, expecting. I felt the sun on my face, and the world was back, and I was saying thank you, over and over. I stayed there on the ground until I heard screams from the far end of the square and, eventually, the sirens.